Alrighty, well, welcome everybody to the American Institute of Philosophical and Cultural Thought. This is our 8th annual Creativity Conference. The way this came about was that the Foundation and the Societies for the Philosophy of Creativity noticed that the Central Division APA did not care what we were doing, as they made abundantly evident by their lack of presence at our meetings at the Central APA, and so I suggested that we move the Creativity Society's Central Division meeting here. We still have an Eastern Division and a Pacific Division, and apparently there's a little more interest in those, in the kinds of programming that we put together. Obviously, the philosophy of creativity is the center of what the foundation does. This foundation was started at SIU sometime in the 60s. Well, it was chartered in 1957, but anyway, there was a professor of the philosophy of communication named William S. Minor, who, with his sisters, left a lot of money to the United States, to SIU, and can you edit that out? That can't be a Freudian slip. It's got to be something worse than Freud, like a Dissadian slip. Anyway, so SIU has put together a number of different things using the bequest of William S. Minor and his sisters. And among those things is the programming that we do here at AIPCT. Not all of it by any means, but a good bit of it. So anyway, this year we had the privilege of hosting John Min from College of Southern Nevada for a residency, and he's working on Emerson. Turns out that we're pretty well endowed with regard to Emerson. And so John visited here for the Dewey concert. I have not been drinking. Conference. It was the workshop on Dewey and decolonial thought, and came over here for a reception and noticed the Emerson and said, hey, I'm going to work my way from Nevada to Boston, and this would be a good stop in between to check out the letters and the journals and the collected works and all of that we have here. And so that is what created the reason for an Emerson focus, is John's presence with us. Also, when we have resident fellows, we ask that they give a residency lecture, and that's also what he'll be doing after we have our first talk. And we will be having our first talk. That's gonna occur very, very soon now. I'm done talking about all the things I have to talk about, except Brian Stanfield, who I met when I arrived here 25 years ago. He was interested in Whitehead and was reasonably excited that suddenly there was somebody to study Whitehead with, because the Whitehead scholar had retired from SIU. And so anyway, we began talking about Whitehead, but that evolved into Emerson and Whitehead, which then evolved into Emerson, which is where it has been for the last 10 years or so. Brian has some very interesting things to say about Emerson. I have followed him through this research process, and as John will probably say as well, tracking down any single idea in Emerson, it's almost like a decade-long commitment if you're gonna. And so Brian has been in pursuit of genius. John has been in pursuit of democracy. Anderson has had enough decades to have done many concepts in Emerson, but we'll get to him later. So Brian is the chair of the philosophy program at John A. Logan College down the road in Carterville, and also managed to get elected to the Carbondale City Council. So he's become a politician in addition to being an Emerson scholar. So I'm proud to call him my friend. And before you leave, I want you to admire that heavy mahogany door between here and the kitchen, because Brian hung that door alone. It was one of the more impressive things I've ever seen happen. So anyway, he's not just a brain walking around, or a transparent eyeball walking around. Transparent eyeball cannot hang a door, but Brian Stanfield can. Make him feel welcome.
was
was
like, I
amazing.
kind of vaguely remember it happening, but I really, the only thing holding it up was desperation, I think. All right, so how many of you here teach? Okay, so I've got a guilty confession. My paper title is a lie. It says, Emerson's Genius, the Consoler of the Human Condition. Okay, sounds great, except that's not what actually Emerson said. I'll get to that in a second. So I'm teaching 21 hours this semester by accident, didn't intend to, that's a lot. And so I've been scrambling for the last week and a half trying to get everything ready, syllabi, activities and things. And one of those classes is world religions. That's rooted around, or completely based on this idea of the human condition. That somehow seeped into my telling Randy what my title was going to be, right? Genius in the Human Condition. Emerson actually uses the term the mortal condition. So rather than try and hide the, I could have done some really crafty sort of thing like, oh, well, what he means by mortal condition is actually blah, 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 and this is why it's in my title. Nah, I'm just going to call myself out on it and say, yeah, oops, sorry. That happens. But I think what happened, so, okay, this is a creativity conference. I'm among friends. So we all know that novelty can only happen through error. So in the spirit of Alfred North Whitehead and the great philosopher Bob Ross, I'll call this a happy little accident. Because what happened is when I started to go track down how am I going to retrofit this human condition thing into this paper, I started looking at, okay, where does he use mortal condition? Right? Genius is the consoler of the mortal condition. I'll keep coming back to that. You ought to be asking yourself two things. What's genius? And what's the mortal condition? Those are the correct two questions. So the first happy little accident. I looked down up the use of this, where I got this quote. It came from a lecture that he did at an address very late in his life. So if you're in the collected works of 12 volumes of his entire life's work, it was in volume 11 somewhere. So right at the end of his life, he did a little spiel at the celebration of Shakespeare's 300th birthday, if you can imagine that, right? Now, so I was like, well, Shakespeare, well, that's interesting. The mortal condition thing started kind of rung a bell, and so I started looking, and I thought, what is it that he might have been thinking about? And then it's, of course, Hamlet, right? And you all know this, maybe the most famous soliloquy in all of human history, right, is to be or not to be, right? That is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep no more. And by a sleep, to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For that sleep of death, what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life, right? And it's this mortal coil thing that I think Emerson was actually directly referencing when he talks about the mortal condition. I think it was an intentional reference. There's no way I can possibly prove that. But Emerson's a clever fellow, and he loved Shakespeare. He would have known Shakespeare probably forwards and backwards, and he's one of his great men that he wrote about. So I think his reference to the mortal coil, or the mortal condition, is actually a direct, kind of a nod to Shakespeare and the mortal coil. Now, what does that mean? Hamlet's talking about the human condition. This is where I was going to try and retrofit everything into my clever title, right? But honestly, Shakespeare and Emerson both do this incredibly well. A few short verses basically sum up the entire problem of the human condition, right? So that admission now out, I feel a little less dirty saying it up front, why my title doesn't actually match what I'm talking about, but it does. It doesn't, it does. Get used to it, that's Emerson. So why genius? Okay. For now, I'll defer back to the using mortal condition for the most part because it matches what he actually wrote. But I'll admit that although my title is mistaken, my thesis is not. Genius is indeed the consoler of the mortal condition. Although this particular address on Shakespeare that I was just talking about comes at the end of Emerson's career, it becomes a way to frame Emerson's vast canon of writings in terms of a series of problems, as well as the answers to those problems. Now, anybody who's ever talked to me for more than 10 minutes has probably heard this next spiel. If I return back to the beginning of Emerson's career, Nature, his first published work, first paragraph of his first book, boom, right there, the entirety of his career is defined by this next paragraph. Okay? He says, our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, and criticism. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face, we through their eyes. Why should not we also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should not we have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and a religion by revelation to us and not a history of theirs? My citation, volume 1, page 1, right? Now, everything is right there. Everything you need to know Emerson is right there. And the more you read Emerson, the more you realize it's true, right? And it sounds kind of bombastic, but honestly, no, because when at the end of his career, he's talking about the mortal condition and genius being the consoler of the mortal condition, he's referring to this. And so I'm going to play that out a little bit over the next few minutes. He continues by asking in the same essay, why should we grope among the dry bones of the past or put the living generation into masquerade out of its faded wardrobe? He answers his own question with the bold claim, the sun shines today also, let us demand our own works and laws and worship. This opening paragraph from this first publication sets out a series of problems and solutions that would define the entirety of his career. So why am I framing all of this as genius? He didn't say genius anywhere in there. This is another happy accident. It happened over several years of intensively reading Emerson with Randy. Every time we hit an essay, I would see, he used genius again, right? And through the first 2 series of essays, it shows up in just about every essay, often multiple times. So I was, kind of curious, trying to figure out what's going on here. Because if you want to understand Emerson, you want to try and find a pattern. Well, there's a pattern here. So, once I noticed it, I saw it everywhere. It's used in nearly every single one of his writings and multiple times in many of his writings. Genius, however, while it occurs frequently, is only rarely acknowledged or explained by Emerson and almost never defined in a satisfactory manner. I decided to do what I thought would be a quick search of the word genius in Emerson's writings. Right? There used to be a website called rwe.org, and it doesn't exist anymore, I don't think. I tried looking it up yesterday, and there was like no access. I don't even know. It was weird. I don't know if it's behind a paywall now or something, but it was just the screen was blank. So I didn't get to do my clever research. I'm like that. I feel kind of weird. I don't get to do my strange numbers research that I do with this. But what I did in the old website was you can do a word search through his entire collected works. The old 1906 complete works. Right? Complete works, collected works. Oh, it's getting switched around. Complete works. Sorry, I should know. The complete works is now not the standard. The collected works is the modern standard through Harvard, but they definitely aren't available online. And so the collected works were, the complete works were. And so anyway, what I do, I typed in genius to see how many times it showed up. 983 times in collected works. Right? Turns out that it is not the most used word, but I mean, of course there are words like the shows up. I didn't check that, right? But as far as words go, like as far as ideas, conceptual words go, this is one of his most used words. Like God shows up 980 times, right? He uses genius more than God. Nature shows up a whole lot more, 3,649 times. So, and soul, a little bit more, 1,200 times. But So what's this mean? There's this word, genius. Like, we know what Emerson means when he talks about God. He's got essays on God. He's got essays on nature, entire book on nature and stuff. Not one thing on genius. Not one. Not one essay on genius. Right? It shows up everywhere. It's used in almost every single one of his writings and is not once really defined. You know, and so this is a challenge, right? So now I realize this can turn into a silly numbers game if I take it too far, but what is revealed is more of an idea that Emerson uses this so frequently that he doesn't even think to explain it. It's so central to what he thinks that he doesn't even consider that it needs to be defined, right? Let alone the word genius itself. The way it got used changed in his lifetime, right? That's a whole separate consideration, but for right now, it used to mean somebody who was just kind of possessed, you know, by the great spirits or something, and it turned into somebody who's really, really smart and could do good stuff, right? In his lifetime, that changed, you know what I mean? And so, aside from that, he still uses genius so consistently in so many different ways, but doesn't think to explain it. So he wrote an entire book on nature. He wrote a long and often referenced essay on oversoul, not a peep on genius. And yet that concept is so ubiquitous in his thought, it shows up in nearly every single thing he says. So what's this mean? It clearly operates in the background of his thinking. It's holding together a lot of his varied treatments of seemingly random ideas. But since this paper is limited, right, I could go on forever. I'll try and sum up what he means by genius really simply, give some examples, and then talk about the next problem, another happy accident. So, boil it down, genius means connectedness to God. Okay, that doesn't sound all that crazy, right? Or as he says in the opening of Nature, an original relation to the universe. Okay, that's even more interesting. That was, you know, in that opening paragraph. In other words, genius is the core idea that I said earlier, defines the entirety of his career. In fact, in a letter from Emerson to a former student of his, he describes the early stages of his career before he was publishing. He says, I was at the very time already writing every night in my chamber, my thoughts on morals and the beautiful laws of compensation and of individual genius, which to observe and illustrate have given sweetness to my many years of life. Right? This is him looking back on the beginning of his career. Right? Moral laws, compensation, genius. Those are the things he remembers being so important to him that he wrote about it every night. His assessment of his own career is defined by his interest in genius. Although he writes, in this case, individual genius, when taken in context with his morals and laws of compensation, what he means by individual genius is not simply individual greatness or cleverness or a doctrine of hero worship, but rather the manifestation of genius itself. In other words, Emerson's interest in and use of genius is a representation of connectedness to God. So, there are three ways he uses genius. Three, I call them manifestations of genius, because they aren't exactly inventions of his. He just uses it in three distinct ways, right? That if the genius is a connectedness to God, these are the three ways that God is in the world represented in genius. First, the genius of nature. Second, genius in history. And third is individual abilities, right? Examples are everywhere in his writings, and so are incredibly intertwined and layered, incredibly intertwined and layered that it is often maddening to try to tease out the differences. I'll give three quick examples in order to allow me to set the stage and then move on. In the Method of Nature, this is the first essay he wrote after the book Nature. The Method of Nature, he simply calls nature's method the genius of nature. Right? I mean, there you go. Okay, there's a definition, but that's not really a definition. It's not telling you much of anything. This is what Joseph Urbis refers to as the unifying theme of causation in his seminal work, Emerson's Metaphysics, A Song of Laws and Causes. He was here not too long ago. The second manifestation of genius is historical, what Emerson calls the spirit and genius of an age in the New England Reformers, and what he refers to as a genius of a nation, which is not to be found in its numerical citizens, but which characterizes the society in nominalist and realist. In other words, pervading character of a time or place. There is, for example, a particular genius that defines ancient Athens. On the other hand, there are individuals within those times and places who stand as representative of their cultures. For instance, Plato stands as a representative figure of Athens. This is the third manifestation of genius, as unique individual ability, both as receiving and also expressing one's connectedness to the universe. Now, that receiving and expressing is a common thing with Emerson. It goes both ways. The door swings both ways, right? And you don't catch it one side or the other all the time, right? You never quite know which side you're looking at. In fact, now I think about it, oh, this is interesting. At the very beginning of Experience, where he wakes up on the stairs, is that the beginning of Experience, where he wakes up on the staircase and doesn't know if he's been going up or down the stairs? He kind of can't tell because it's endless in either direction. He really doesn't know what he's doing. Huh. Oh, jeez. Okay, so now I just want to wander off and think about that for a while. Emerson does this to you, right? So here's one passage from the Oversoul where he uses all three versions of this, but never actually uses the word genius unless you're looking for it, right? He says, we distinguish the announcements of the soul, its manifestations of its own nature, by the term revelation. I'll talk about this in a minute. He uses traditional language, or religious language in very different ways, very different, unorthodox ways. These are always attended by the emotion of the sublime, the revelations. For this communication is an influx of the divine mind into our own mind. Right? This is important enough that I'm going to repeat that. This is an influx of the divine mind into our own mind. Right? The incoming. Right? It is an ebb of the individual rivulet before the flowing surges of the sea of life. Every distinct apprehension of the central commandment agitates men with awe and delight. A thrill passes through all men at the reception of new truth, or at the performance of great action, which comes out of the heart of nature. In these communications, the power to see is not separated from the will to do, but the insight proceeds from obedience, and the obedience proceeds from a joyful perception. Now, at the very end where he talks about joyful perception, that's key, right? I'm going to come back to that later. I promise. But in the meantime, I'd like to point out that while the word genius doesn't actually appear in that passage, he uses it, all three of those definitions I gave, he uses it in that one passage in terms of genius of nature, the genius of an age or an era, and a person. Right? So he clearly shows that we're connected to God. It's from the essay Oversoul, which is all about this. Right? If you have any doubt, just go read that. In addition, in the Oversoul, he uses the word genius 6 times, right, in that one essay. It kind of flies under the radar. Nobody really ever notices that, except that genius explains exactly what he's talking the entire time about the Oversoul and how we fit into the Oversoul, right? For example, he explains that the same omniscience flows into the intellect and makes what we call genius in the Oversoul. It's that inflow of divinity within us. That's called genius, he says, right? Now, this is an example of how Emerson uses a single word, genius, to frame an entire passage of his writing, yet never explains any more about it. Just genius and then moves on, right? In like fashion, his use of genius is tacit in much of his writing, yet never really treated as an object to be studied itself. It's frustrating, it's maddening, it's addicting. So, let's get back to the mortal condition, right? That gives you an idea of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about genius, kind of what he means, give you an example. There's so many examples everywhere. By the way, and this doesn't come up, and I didn't write this in here. Natural History of Intellect, the last thing he did, the lectures he did at Harvard, that comes up more times than anything else in that last series of essays he did. Genius became very important to him at the end of his life. And when you look at his lectures, they really point back to exactly what I'm saying, back to the opening in nature. So when Emerson asks why we do not enjoy an original relation to the universe and that opening to nature, he appears to be making an ontological claim that we are disconnected from God. In Emerson's Metaphysics, however, Joseph Urbis, which I just talked about, has already tackled this problem, as noted, and he demonstrates with great clarity that causation is the unifying theme in Emerson's Metaphysics. There is no problem of discontinuity between individuals and the universe, and there is no break between our contemporaries, our ancestors, nature, or God. Thus, we are faced with a new question. Why do we feel like we are broken from God? Right? Does that make sense, the difference I'm talking about? He's not claiming that we are broken from God. He's just saying we feel like we're broken from God. Right? So, if we examine how Emerson frames the problem in the opening paragraph of Nature, we can see the different emphasis. Let me restate this. Why should we not also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Right? If we focus on the enjoyment of our relation to the universe, Emerson's problem takes a different form. It is not that Emerson believes that we've lost our relation to the universe and God. Rather, we just don't enjoy the benefits of this relatedness anymore. He's introducing what he sees as the problem of the human condition. Mortal condition. That we don't actually realize that we have this original relation. Somehow it got lost in the wash, I guess. Or perhaps we've forgotten. Or lack the courage to behold God and nature face to face, right, as he claims we would like to have. These are all versions of the same problem. Redemption of the soul, in order to restore to the world original and eternal beauty, which he says at the end of Nature is the goal here, right? Redemption of the soul. So I'm going to venture out on a limb here and refer to the collection of problems that Emerson treats in each of these writings under the heading of sin. Right? This made Randy bristle when I first brought this up a long time ago. But I think I have to, because there's no other way to sum it up, right? Now, several caveats to the use of this word, which is widespread. He uses the word himself, not consistently. It's all over the place, unsurprisingly. But what he doesn't mean is like the fall of man and the moral evil and decrepitude of us sinners, right? He doesn't mean it that way, right? It still loosely retains its traditional Hebrew meaning of missing the mark of God's perfection. Simple as that. I have the hardest time teaching this to my students, right? The hardest time in my world religions class. This treatment of sin is far from orthodox. Well, I mean, unless it's Orthodox Judaism, I guess. As with many of Emerson's writings, he tends to treat things with both reverence and iconoclasm. Even the traditional ideas. He has a tendency to treat both sides of a traditional problem, appreciating tradition while at the same time condemning its unquestioned orthodoxy. If he tells us at the beginning of Nature that he is looking for a philosophy of insight and not of tradition, he's not denouncing tradition, but rather our tendency to grope among the dry bones of the past. Right? These are all his words. I'm using quotation marks around everything. So tradition may be valuable and should be venerated if it preserves some kind of living insight, right? So Emerson's almost like punk, but not. You know what I mean? He's like a cow punk, I think. Right? So if not, it should be re-examined. His treatment of sin follows the same approach. While appearing to be quite orthodox in his discussions, he has quite unorthodox ideas of what the problems of sin actually reveal. Several considerations temper his use of sin. What he means by sin can be summarized with what he describes at the end of Nature as the ultimate solution to our mortal condition. The problem of restoring to the world original and eternal beauty, I mentioned this earlier, is solved by redemption of the soul. The ruin or the blank that we see when we look at nature is in our own eye. The reason why the world lacks unity and lies broken in heaps is because man is disunited with himself. So the soul, that the soul requires redemption is tacitly assumed by Emerson in most of his writing. And this problem of our mortal condition is what he means by sin. Right? Obviously the next problem is like, what does he mean by redemption? Right? It's not salvation in the traditional fire and brimstone type of sermons. Right? The source of this problem of sin is that a soul becomes disunited with itself, and while Emerson often describes sin in seemingly familiar Christian terms, such as being fallen in the oversoul or broken in history, we must remember that his discussion of both the problem and its solution are original. In fact, Emerson's thought is explicitly contrary to traditional Christian themes, as we see in his shocking writings such as Divinity School Address or the Lord's Supper. Again, if you haven't read those, man, you should. You're in for a treat. Divinity School Address, he tells all of the graduating Divinity School students, like, well, congratulations, you wasted all your time in here looking at these books, right? Look out the window, that's where God is, right? And then he was no longer invited to Harvard for the next 40 years, right? And so that lecture series I was telling you at the end of his life, that's the only time he got to go back to Harvard. So, and at that, then he says, what I said back then, I was right. That's what it meant, see? You know? So, the Lord's Supper is his giving up his ministry position. Couldn't do it anymore. Just couldn't believe in the stupidness of the Eucharist of all things. You know what I mean? It's like, that's just dumb. If you want to celebrate the life of Christ, don't do it by eating his body and drinking his blood. Do it by washing feet. Right? That's service. That's humility, right? This is wow, right? And so, and he says, and there's a mic drop moment. He left the church, right? That's done. That's why I'm leaving. Boom, out. So this gives you a feeling. If you don't know Emerson, this gives you a feeling for cowpunk, right? So because of its tendency to use traditional terms in new ways, it is important to keep track of his own particular meanings as he discusses them and to avoid any mundane understanding of what he means. His unique views of the traditional problems of the church are what necessitated doctrine of sin that is specifically Emersonian in the first place. Now, another aside here. In the middle of trying to do my dissertation on genius, I ran into this problem of sin and realized there's a second dissertation to be done here before I can do the dissertation on genius, right? Very frustrating problem. And the even weirder part is nobody's written on any of this. 0 people have written about genius. No, there are a couple of people who have mentioned genius not like this. And nobody's talked about sin either as a problem for Emerson. Like, okay, right? So you dream of finding like that idea that nobody's ever written on, and then you like stumble into a second one in the midst of it, and you panic like I do and stick your head in the sand. So, in short, for Emerson, the problem of sin is the result of a soul that has become disunited with itself. Our tendency to forget that unity is what Emerson generally means when he uses the term sin, disunity, as an indicator of the many reasons why we do not actually enjoy a unity with God. This is similar to how Islam defines the core problem of the human condition, not as sin, but as ghafla, or forgetfulness. We just forget to put God first. It's not intentional. It's not because we're wicked. We're kind of dumb, you know? We get preoccupied, life gets in the way, we forget to do it. We forget that we're connected to God. In other words, what I mean by an Emersonian doctrine of sin is that while we always are and remain united with God, for one reason or another, we lose track of that. To miss the mark is to be disunited from God, which is also to be disunited from ourselves. A clear example of Emerson's unorthodox approach to traditional problems. This is double-edged alienation from both ourselves and from God, which in the end amounts to the same thing for Emerson. Right? Disunity from myself is disunity from God. The need for redemption brings that unity of the soul with God back into the foreground. One last caveat. When Emerson explicitly discusses sin, it is usually accompanied by one or more elaborations on what he means by the term. While it's possible to compose a list of all the different ways he talks about our mortal condition or sin or any of these things, there's no way to make an exhaustive list. It's just too all over the place. Right? His writings are simply too vast and complex to create a neatly structured codex of his thought. It's possible, however, to look at an informal collection of terms which accompany his use of sin, which I'm about to do. And in the interest of time, I'll look at just a couple, give you an example of what I'm talking about, and then look at how he sees genius as being the solution to these problems. So we're going to look at a couple problems, and hopefully you can see, start to unpack what he's saying and figure out where he's going to go with this. Right? Example 1. partiality. This is a tricky one. This is actually all over the place in his writing, but in different language. This is the trick with Emerson. I know it's partiality. He's not saying partiality, but I know that's exactly what he's talking about, right? So you can recognize the patterns once you know the patterns to be recognized, but you can't find the patterns to be recognized because he doesn't tell you what the patterns are, right? It's just one of those things. How do you figure this out? You just read more Emerson. How do you understand? Well, you just read more Emerson, right? So partiality. This is a sin that he examines in Nominalist and Realist, where he writes about nature. Nature resents generalizing and insults the philosopher in every moment with a million of fresh particulars. It is all idle talking. As much as a man is whole, so is he also a part. And it were partial not to see it. What do you say in your pompous distribution? What you say in your pompous distribution only distributes you into your class and section. You have not got rid of parts by denying them, but are the more partial. Right? So while nature bombards you with fresh particulars, constantly, right? The experiential part of nature, we are reminded that we are partial or limited in our ability to resist the fullness of nature. This limited aspect, again, is what sin literally means, missing the mark. Right? We're imperfect. We're limited. Likewise, in circles, Emerson famously claims that the only sin is limitation. So what does the solution look like? Hey, you're particular. I don't know. That's a problem? Yes. So what's the solution look like? You ready? You're already familiar with what Emerson says about the solutions to problems because I talked about them a little early on. But his essay titles all scream the solutions: oversoul, nature, self-reliance, transcendentalism. The titles are the answer to the problems, right? Every one of his essays is a solution to a problem. He doesn't spend a whole lot of time talking about the actual problem, though. He's so excited to get to the solution. And it's brilliant solutions, right? Yeah. But the problem with both sin and genius is that, I know, but I want to get to the good stuff, right? Because he spends so much time journaling and writing to himself about these things. I'm sure he's already gone through it in his head. So he races ahead to the answers, right? For instance, self-reliance is one of the ways that genius consoles the problem of sin, if one takes into account what Emerson means by self-reliance. In his later lectures, he says, self-reliance, the height and perfection of man, is reliance on God. Right? Self-reliance is God-reliance. Why? Because you're already connected with God. So to be your full self, you simply acknowledge that you are God, right? I mean, you have to go there with that. So in other words, redemption means that one must realize or remember one's unity with God. Okay, another example, brokenness. In history, he says, man is the broken giant, and in all his weakness, both his body and his mind are invigorated by habits of conversation with nature. The solution, conversation with nature, is what he means by genius, because if you remember, the genius of nature is how we have that conversation with nature. I said like on page 2 or something like that. The notion of brokenness, the broken giant, is an example of traditional Christian trope that Emerson treats in an unorthodox way. Yeah, we're broken giants, right? The broken giant suffers from partiality, the last sin. This is why it's so frustrating, because this actually is the same as the last sin I talked about, although it's different. The broken giant suffers from partiality because sin is a diminution of ability rather than the acquisition of evil. Right? Sin is not a moral imperfection. We're not morally broken, just lesser versions of ourselves. For Emerson, brokenness is not a loss, but it's merely a depravity or a momentary confusion. So how does genius solve this problem? Now let's return back to nature again, where Emerson insinuates an answer. Man is a dwarf of himself, he says, echoing the same kind of idea. And people are a god in ruins, he says. Right? Brokenness suggests for Emerson that we are not lost or ruined, but that we have broken down. We missed the mark of our perfect union. You know, it's interesting. We've missed the mark with our perfect union of God because we have forgotten our divine origins. Genius means remembering one's connection with God and restoring oneself to fullness. The brokenness, it just dawned on me, is what dukkha means in Buddhism. It's basically the wheel that's broken down and gotten all wobbly and doesn't work right anymore. That's what dukkha actually means, like dislocation or just sort of like it's just broken down, right? Okay, so we got sin, gafla, and dukkha. I'll try and fit in my other three religions if I can in the next page. At this point, this is turning into like a scavenger hunt for my students or something. At this point, I find I have to resist dragging in every single thing I can think of with every single essay, although I've already started doing that. But I hope these two examples are enough to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, both in the problem of sin and how genius is kind of a tacit answer to that, that's already operating in the background of framing the problem. So I'll make a couple parting observations about this. Genius is Emerson's own term. I didn't insert my own opinions about this. I didn't invent some creative way to reread Emerson. These are his own terms. Right? This is his own language, and it's so important to him that it's everywhere. So I'm not just layering me onto Emerson as so many people do. It's really easy to do. I'm just simply fascinated by the way he uses it over and over again with such frequently that it virtually becomes background noise, when in fact I'm convinced that the entire driving force behind his thinking is genius, right? So if we aren't actually disconnected from God, and if we are never truly separate, then why does genius need to be a consoler of anything, right? In other words, if we only perceive that there is a problem, when in fact there isn't one, because we're never really disconnected from God, we just think we are, then why do we believe we're perceiving it in the first place, that brokenness or the partiality or all these problems? Right? So this all boils down to a version of the problem of evil. Right? All the great philosophical problems do in some way, shape, or form. If God is everywhere and in all things, then what is causing us to perceive a gap in God? Right? Where can there be not God? Because the problem of sin would suggest that me feeling disconnected from God would suggest that God's not there. But that's not true. So where does that ignorance come from? Right? Don't know. Emerson doesn't know either. Right? That is the human condition. Right? And so that, now I can justify my title, I guess, right? Now I can say it is about the human condition. But that's the problem right there. If we're connected from God, and we know we're connected from God ontologically, metaphysically, in every sort of way, then why don't we see it? Right? So this is the crux of the human condition, and there's really no good answer for it. All's not lost, however, as Emerson reassures us. Genius consoles us in all forms. So if we look back over what he wrote in The Oversoul, we can see that the reception of new truth, if you remember me emphasizing this, the reception of new truth and the performance of great action, the coming in and going out, come from an influx of the divine mind into our own mind. Right? I've repeated that line specifically because of this. The influx of the divine mind into our own mind is what he means by genius. This is the joyful perception that he refers to, and that I said I'd return to earlier in the paper. Right? He says that there's a joyful perception that comes from this influx of the divine mind. It's a recognition or remembering that we are not alone. Simply remembering. Right? Why do we feel alone? Who knows? Right? Returning to the opening of nature, Emerson asks, why should not we also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should not we have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and a religion by revelation to us and not by the history of theirs, right? It is this joyful perception of our original relation to the universe that demonstrates Emerson's redemption of the soul that he asks for at the end of nature. Right? This is why he considers genius. Right? The redemption of the soul is the problem to be solved at the beginning of his career. At the end of his career, he says genius is the consoler of our mortal condition. And that is what he's talking about right here. It's not that we aren't broken from God, or that we simply just have to admit that we're not broken from God. we need to enjoy that we are connecting to God. It's that enjoyment of the connectedness that seems to be what he considers to be the redemption, right? Which is why sin seems to fit here, because there is a redemption doctrine for Emerson. It's just very different. It involves genius, not what you think, right? Okay, I think that's that. So, wow.
Must be. Thank you, Brian.
Yeah.
What do we do?
Oh, now we have questions and answers. I believe, I could be wrong about this, but I believe that you might have raised some questions in the minds of these, in particular Danny. And so, if the rough and tumble of the Carbondale City Council has not fitted you to field your own questions,
I can take anything.
I don't know what would. And so I'm going to get out of the way and you field your own questions, although I do have one at some point.
You have to come up and state your name and your residence.
That's what they make you do at City Council.
Anyway, I couldn't stop thinking about your referencing of Shakespeare in the fact that Shakespeare is one of Emerson's references, and I was wondering if you did a search, seeing how many words that you saw popping up in Emerson pop up in Shakespeare.
No, not even close. No.
Because
I couldn't possibly even conceive of how to do that.
well, the thing is what I couldn't help but think of what you were talking about with partiality had me thinking of the scene in The Merchant of Venice.
Sure.
With like
Jesus,
Flash.
now there's.
I'm sorry. I'm gonna
That's your project. I want you to tell me. I'm sure. Right, as you say, Shakespeare was so influential on him. He was one of the few people that he included as
I was thinking
the great
more
figures.
as well as just like that's kind of just the theme in Shakespearean tragedies.
Sure.
This idea of what sin is in Emerson,
Mm-hmm.
because the tragic fall
Yeah.
for all of the characters, whether it's Othello, Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, King Lear, is the fact that they become disconnected to God, and, and who is God? Their community.
So, okay, that's interesting. I'll think just about Hamlet because, I was thinking about it as I discovered. It's like, Hamlet's problem is not that he feels disconnected, it's that he doesn't do anything about it until it's too late.
Well,
Right?
And
that's the tragedy of it.
His disconnection is not knowing when to act.
Yeah, and that's ultimately the tragedy is that he waited too long, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so Emerson would presumably be familiar with this as a problem, right? Don't wait, dum-dum, right? I mean, oh man, there's so many things going on here. The role of the poet for Emerson is incredibly important. I didn't even touch on it here because I would have gone off on that forever. His essay called "The Poet" is incredible. It cracks the code for the expressive art of genius. But he also calls Shakespeare the poet in Uses of Great Men. And so he's familiar enough with Shakespeare to know these kinds of themes and to also have probably already thought about how it would apply, right? But for him, Hamlet's sin was sitting and talking about, feeling left out, not knowing what to do, rather than trying to figure out what to do. And Emerson, in each of these essays where it says, hey, go be self-reliant means get up, go figure out what to do and experience. He wakes up in the middle of the stairway where he's in the middle of these stairs that go infinitely in either direction, doesn't know what he did. How did you get there? Am I going up or down? I don't even know. But he says at the end, like, up again, old heart, let's go. Right? Let's go. Do something. Don't do nothing. Right? And I think that's kind of, I don't know how. There are so many themes in Shakespeare that it would be fun to do this, but I can't even begin to figure out how to do
that
it.
stairs thing also reminds me of a rather famous English poem about staircases, but that's a
Probably.
side tangent.
I'm sure he would have read it, probably. Emerson was incredibly well read, so this is the stuff that we can't know. Some people have written books on, like, here's what Emerson read. Emerson's library, or, went to the library to see the things he checked out or something. I mean, you only can scratch the surface of what Emerson knew. His journals would probably be a better way to find that information. I haven't even touched the journals on this genius stuff because I'm sure that it is even more rife, right? So, but he's always in dialogue. And that, again, I think for him, is the inactivity is a sin, right? And that's actually one of the things that I spent some time defining in another version of this. So. Anybody else? Yeah, please.
So you mentioned that during Emerson's lifetime, the kind of concept of genius evolved. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on Emerson's relation to that, whether he may have influenced it, or if he was trying to resist it, possibly? It's very speculative, of course, but I'm just curious.
I don't know. And I have a hunch he played a part in it, at least in the United States. No. But I don't know that he actively changed the way, it might have been a shift in the culture. And that he may have been part of that shift, experiencing it and also promoting it. I'm not entirely sure, but it changed from simply somebody who was possessed by God to somebody who was doing amazing things that none of us could do. Touched by God or something, you know what I mean? But for him, this is why the poet is so important, because the poet is a person who's touched by God, but is also out there expressing in ways for us to learn about ourselves in ways that we should have always already known anyway, right? It's a very democratic element. So God has delivered this great person, but the great person is to be used by us. That's the opening essay in Great Men, is the uses of great men, right? We use them, they don't use us. So did he actively change the meaning of genius? I don't know. I just know that at the end of his life, with the sciences radically shifting, the use of genius for mathematicians and scientists and stuff, became more commonplace. At the beginning of his life, it was more of a religious mystic kind of possession by God type of thing, right? So I don't know. I will say there's a movie, probably from the 50s, called Henry Fonda, Mr. Roberts.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
That's right. That's the name of it.
Right? And he's on this merchant marine vessel, and somewhere midway through the movie, it's just a throwaway line. He comes in. Somebody comes in and says, "Hey, I got this great news." He's like, "Oh, I suppose you're just going to start quoting Emerson to me now," or something, right? And I was like the inspirational great news guy, right? And it was such a dismissive throwaway tone that every one of those kids must have read Emerson in school.
Oh,
Like so much.
it was required.
That they're just like, ugh, not more Emerson, please, right? To the fact that they're making fun of them in an Academy Award-winning movie. That tells you something about what happened with Emerson, right? I mean, he was everywhere, he was in everything and then gone. I mean, Dewey, you could say the same thing, right? He wrote about everything and then just everyone was just perfectly happy to forget about it, right? So, okay, anybody else? Yeah, Courtney.
I'm not very familiar with Emerson. My background is more Valerian. And as I'm listening to you talk, it struck me that I wonder, you mentioned that he couldn't define genius and what have you.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the other things you talked about, the revelation and then the expression.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if he maybe actually saw genius as a process, a dynamic process, and not necessarily an object.
Yeah, no, and that's kind of what I'm saying. Is at the beginning of career, we are conduits of God. We are conduits of this process, this divine process. At the end of his life, it was more like, here's this thing that you can do. Like it's a skill or something, you know what I mean? And that's part of the transition. That the older meaning of genius is really what he's trying to communicate here. This idea that we are embodiments of God, of the divine process here in the world, right? And that's where his essays are really, every single one of them is pointing to some version of that.
Yeah.
And that's exactly it.
And that seems to be a slow trickle of understanding throughout human common sense of this static world that we were essentially taught about. Even 3 dimensions is the static way of drawing things.
Yeah.
And the dynamic
Mhm.
universe, which of course comes out when Einstein's theories show that it's all in motion. And that, I believe we actually live right there in the equal sign between E and MC squared. Where that burn of the cigarette that's just flowing. And that maybe that's the part he couldn't try to understand, or he was trying to explain, but maybe himself didn't understand with this. It's all a dynamic process,
He was much more interested in biology than he was physics.
which is a dynamic process.
Yes, absolutely. So, I don't know if that reveals anything for you or not, but I think
No,
it does.
I was sitting there going, wow, it sounds like he's stuck in this understanding of dynamics.
A great lover of
coming from
Goethe, by the way,
Stanfield.
who he also wrote about as one of his great men. So,
Interesting. I'm more really interested now.
yeah. I mean, volume one is his first collection of essays, masterpiece. Second collection, so much good stuff in there. That's great follow up. Taken together, those two of them, you don't need anything else. You can read those over and over and over again and find something new every single time.
Thanks very
It's
much.
the hermeneutic revelation right there. Okay, anybody else curious? Yeah, please.
Oh yeah, thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
In my studies of Emerson, I guess like the concept I've included on is the religious sentiment or the moral sentiment.
Mhm.
You made all these great connections between Emerson and all these different religions. So I was just wondering if you could speak about that relationship between genius and the religious sentiment. What they have to do with each other. Sometimes they
It's
seem
connectedness
synonymous, but sometimes
with God.
different.
Yeah, you know, I mean, and whatever you think God is, right? For him, God can mean all kinds of different things, right? I'm not. You can be complete. You can probably be. Let me think about this. Yeah, you can at least be agnostic and still believe that the connectedness to the universe, right, means something, right? I see Whitehead in this, right? That's how I kind of came to this through the back door. Whether you call it God, universe, or, you know, the...
That is the front door.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's all religious in that sense with Emerson, right? But then be careful what you mean by that, because he's very careful in history to say the historical church sucks, but the religious experience is really what matters, right? And that's what we get wrong, is everyone is locked down in the historical church, the dry bones of the past that he's talking about. So, oh, everyone's looking at their watch. So,
Well, no, we actually have a few more minutes here. I have an observation and question. So you bring up the issue, why do we feel disconnected from God? My answer to that would be Calvin.
yeah, right.
And Emerson
we're
is surrounded by that enemy of the faith.
Absolutely.
If you were Catholic, or if you were Anglican or Methodist, you don't feel disconnected from God. If you're Catholic, you have the mediation of the church and the saints and the intercession of Mary and all of this. You don't feel alienated unless it's on you. Catholic guilt, right?
Yes, that's what I was about to say.
But exactly. Now, I'm not saying you get out of this. I'm just saying it takes a different form. But if you happen to be Anglican or Methodist, in the event that I am, you never feel alienated from God at all. You're already acceptable to God. The sacrifice of Christ is sufficient for you as well. The problem is, what now does God expect?
Yeah.
Washington Irving said, you'd always tell a Methodist because he pulls his own soul up at the roots to see if it's growing. and so he was looking in Emerson's context at what the Methodists, which are they're just Episcopalians with no money. And so what are they doing? And so the problem is a different one. It's not that you feel alienated from God, it's that you feel too close to God and you know that God has expectations and
That's
you're not
alienating too,
fulfilling
right?
them. And this is not an Emersonian problem. This is a completely different configuration because there's no Calvinism in it.
It's a problem of the human condition, Randy.
Well, okay, so your thesis still addresses it, which is to say, but a genius for an Anglican or a Methodist or a Catholic, I would say, it's a completely different configuration. What you've got there is a Calvinist genius. We need, when I say we, I speak for all the Catholics, Methodists, and Anglicans, right? We need a different kind of genius in order to be connected.
I'm not sure. Okay, so Doug's Emerson.
Doug's a Calvinist.
Yes.
All right, it
My
doesn't count.
Emerson walked away from that, you know, and,
Yeah.
and you know, I mean, he had arguments with.
Well, Doug walked away from that too.
What never quite, you know.
What
it's
if,
like
so
the recovery
look,
Catholic
you're
thing.
not raised in that tradition.
Yeah.
What if you never had to walk away from it? What if it was not impressed on you the way it was Ahab in Moby Dick.
Oh, sure.
What if that's not your God and not your problem?
So, okay, this might come more to your question earlier. Does this have to be framed in religious terms? No, right? I mean, the separateness from God is what I've been using overtly. But what do you mean by God, right? I mean, if you just mean it in terms of like ignorance, like, you know, why are we ignorant of things? Where does that come from, right? This is another problem of does nothing exist or does it not exist? How can it exist if it's something that doesn't exist? Where does ignorance come from, right? That's separateness from God, or it just means, why do I forget stuff? You know what I mean? I blame it on chemotherapy. But you know, I mean,
You were forgetting stuff before that.
I was forgetting stuff before that. So, you know, I mean, these are problems that, you know, he uses distinctly religious language because he was a minister. But in some sense, you know, when he walked away, I think he's more like trying to figure out, well, that's why he was doing essays. Essays are sermons, right? Just for popular audience. Essays were also the main form of communication in the United States, in colonial United States, right? Is they tended to be sermons that had been printed out real quick and then handed out, and that's why the Stamp Act started the revolution. It's because nobody wanted to pay tax to hear the news from the sermons from the neighboring town or whatever, right? And I'm dead serious, right? That was the last straw for Americans. Now you're going to tax us on our pamphlets? Holy crap, you know? And those were sermons. You know, and mostly, and Emerson just takes the sermon form, puts it in an essay. That's why I love Montaigne, because Montaigne was the essayist who was doing sermons and called them essays instead. And he's like, holy crap, I can do that. And you know,
And he
indeed
did.
he did. Doesn't have to be religious, but it's all religious in some sense if you believe in God. Right? You can never get away from that. Right? The interesting thing is that the thing that I find fascinating is if the solution's already there. We're connected to God. Then why do we ever forget that? You know what I mean? And that's the interesting thing, I think. Maybe Muslims have it better. We just forget. It's not because we're wicked, you know.